So this lesson is an introduction to logical fallacies, which are tactics that people and the media use in order to persuade their audience, excuse me. But these arguments are ineffective because they are faulty and don't really make sense. And that's why at the bottom it says this is why your argument might not be as strong as you think. So here are just a list of the Indiana standards that will be addressed throughout this lesson. Um, And then here are the goals of the lesson, which the goals of the lesson are really just to be able to identify logical fallacies that are present in literature, speeches, and the media. So what is a logical fallacy? Um, Logical fallacies are irrelevant points made during an argument that don't really have much evidence that support the claim, and they should be avoided because, like stated before, they do create weak arguments. So the first type of logical fallacy that we're going to cover is a hasty generalization, which is basically making an assumption about a group based on an experience with one member of that group. Below is an example, but I'm not really going to read it to you. If you'd like to go over the example, just pause the video. And the reason that this should be avoided is because just because your experience with one member of a group doesn't really mean that everyone in that group behaves that way. The best way to avoid making this mistake is to avoid stereotypes and fact check, which fact checking is something that's going to come up a lot during this lesson. So the next logical fallacy is missing the point. Um, Missing the point is basically presenting an argument that doesn't support the conclusion at all. So it's kind of like a random tidbit thrown in there as an attempt to persuade your audience. This one's kind of interesting. It's kind of strange to me that people do try to use this to persuade their audience just because it's just random information thrown in there. So, how to avoid this mistake is to double check and see if your claim is supported by the evidence you are given, which is super important. And if you're trying to successfully persuade your audience, you don't want to throw in a whole bunch of random stuff just to throw it in there and say words essentially. So, the next one is post hoc. Post hoc is making the assumption that um, it's almost assuming cause and effect when it's not present. It's the assumption that because one thing happened after another thing, that automatically they're connected. So the best way to avoid this is to explain the relationship if there is a relationship and make sure that every time this happens, the following result will occur. And again, a big one for this one is fact checking, which should be something that's done throughout making an argument and developing arguments in general. So the next fallacy is slippery slope. And this one is very similar to post hoc. Again, it has to do with cause and effect relationship, but this one is more so a chain reaction will occur, and usually the result of this reaction is something that's super crazy, even though a lot of times it's not really true. It's one of those things where it's like, oh, if I go to school today, I'll fall, and if I fall, I'll hurt myself, and if I hurt myself, I'll die, and it's one of those things. That was a really bad example, actually. So, like, excuse that example. But the one that is listed on the slide is a lot better. So the next one is a weak analogy. A weak analogy is basically comparing two or more objects that don't have anything in common and trying to use that to persuade your audience. This one is kind of interesting to me, um, just for the sole purpose that you would think that a lot of people would kind of see that there is no correlation, but I also can see how using this fallacy would work. So the best way to avoid this mistake is just making sure that if you are comparing two items, that they actually relate to each other and it makes sense. The next one is appeal to authority. So appeal to authority is one that is in the media and on social media all the time, and that's using a famous name or figure of authority to persuade your audience. So it's something like the first thing that pops into my mind is Sugar Bear Hair and all the beauty influencers that post the Sugar Bear hair, and they're using that as an attempt to get you to buy it because this famous person is they use it, even though 9 out of 10 times they don't. But that's a whole different thing. Um, so the way to avoid this mistake is don't use celebrities as a testimonial. Most of the things celebrities post, they're being paid for it, therefore it's an ad. And if you do want to talk about someone, make sure that they're an expert in that field and they actually have knowledge with what they are presenting you with. So the next one is ad populum, which in a way is kind of similar to appeal to authority. It's trying to convince your reader or your audience that they need to agree with you because it's the popular opinion. This is also known as the bandwagon fallacy because it's one of those things that you don't want to be different from everybody else, so just agree with me. So, the biggest way to avoid that mistake is make sure that the popular opinion that you are trying to push onto someone is actually right and not just something that everyone's doing just for the fun of it. So the next one is ad hominem, which is attacking the person that has an opposing argument. This one is awful and it's seen a lot in debates and speeches. So the way to avoid this one is separate the person from their opinion. There's no need to bring up personal things about someone just because they have a different viewpoint as you, and focus more on the points that they're making and not their character. The next one is appeal to pity, which is trying to get the audience to agree with you because they feel bad for you. Um, this one I feel like is kind of self-explanatory, and the way to avoid it is don't make your argument emotionally driven. A really good example of this is in the ASPCA commercials where they show you the sad dogs and they play in the arms of an angel and her voice is soothing and sad. And they're doing that to get you to feel bad, so you give them your money and it works. The next one is appeal to ignorance, which is they use the lack of knowledge on a topic to convince the reader or their audience that they're right. Um, the best way to do this is consider the other point of view, and just because there's not a lot of knowledge on a certain topic doesn't necessarily mean that you can kind of twist the narrative to the way that you believe, if that makes sense. So the next one is straw man, which is misrepresenting the opponent's argument to make yours seem stronger. So basically, this is kind of twisting what the other person says, if that makes sense. The example here I think is really interesting, and I would definitely take a time to pause and read it because the example clarifies it a lot. This was one that I struggle with, I'm not gonna lie. So the best way to avoid this mistake is come up with original arguments and that you can provide proof and support for, and then also that makes your argument so much stronger and it shows that you actually know what you're talking about. So the next one is red herring, which is going off on a tangent or off topic to distract the audience from your argument. So this one, I guess this one's self-explanatory too, and the best way to avoid it is to just stay on topic. The next one is false dichotomy. So this one is when the arguer makes it seem as if there are only two opinions and the one that they are arguing is the best. So this one's also really interesting because 9 out of 10 times when you are faced with an issue or have to make a decision, there are more than two options or ways to go about that decision or outcomes. And the best way to avoid making this mistake is consider all the options and outcomes, you know? Next is circular reasoning, which is talking in circles, if that makes sense. So you start the conversation with what you're trying to prove, and then you basically restate the same thing using different words. So the best way to avoid this is actually plan out your argument and work towards your conclusion. Don't start with it. So the next slide is evocation. which is sliding between two or more definitions of the same word or phrase. So this one was also really interesting to me, so I am going to read the example to you, which is giving money to charity is the right thing to do. So charities have a right to your money. So the word that they repeated was money, and right. So they used both definitions of the word right, as in it's the right thing to do, it's morally right, and they have the right to our money like they deserve the money, which I thought was interesting. The best way to avoid this fallacy is to just identify the phrases that are important in your argument and don't flip flop between the definitions of the word just because that emphasis on that single word is manipulating your audience because it'll stick with them. So, the biggest point of this lesson is the use of logical fallacies make your arguments weak. They call for weak arguments because you're just throwing in information that you really can't prove, and the best arguments are ones that you can back up with support and proof.